so I'm here to present my book. I will need it at the end of the talk, but I can maybe give it around now if you want to have a look at it. So I'm here to present my book, Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos, the Philosophical Arugments. So the first half, I guess, of my talk now will be just to explain the whole concept and the goal of the book and why I think this book needed to be written and why it needed to be the way it is now. And then the second half, I will turn to what is more the topic of this series of talks, which is the meaning of transcendental philosophy, which is which is a topic that's addressed in some of the chapters. I'll switch to that then. Maybe I'll wait until the new people are seated and then I'll kick it off. So, Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos, the Philosophical Arugments, the subtitle, the Philosophical Arugments, really says what I try to do in this book, and it is to show that in this famous debate, I don't know if all of you know it, but it has been considered a very famous debate in the history of philosophy, especially 20th century of philosophy, that there is indeed that there are important philosophical stakes that come about in this debate, and also that there is a philosophical coherence to this debate. And by saying that this is the aim of my book, that of course indicates that this is something that had not been considered as such. So there are a lot of misgivings, I would say, preconceptions about the Davos debate that I wanted to get out of the way. But let me first say something about the debate itself. So the Davos debate was this meeting, this public debate between Martin Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer in 1929. And that public debate was part of a larger school, an internationale Hochschulkurse, which took place from March 17 to April 6. So for 3 weeks, in Davos, which is this Swiss Alps town that is now better known for the World Economic Forum to convene. I don't know if it's every year. I know much less about that. And the whole idea, the whole reason for having this school was because after the First World War, there had not been a lot of intellectual contact anymore between academics and specifically philosophers from France and from Germany. And the idea was to bring those intellectuals together again and to have them interchange ideas, to reunite French and German thinkers. It was the second edition, so there had been another edition in 1928. But they really wanted to go big in 1929, and they managed to do so by inviting two very, very big philosophical names at the moment. On the one hand, Ernst Cassirer, who is now largely forgotten, but who was then one of the most renowned German intellectuals at the beginning of the 20th century. And for two reasons. One, because he was very famous as a historian of philosophy. And the second reason is because he was the main figure and the spokesman of Neo-Kantianism, which was at that point one of the most important philosophical schools on the continent. On the other hand, there was Martin Heidegger, who had only just 2 years before published Being in Time, but by doing so had immediately become one of the new young rock stars of philosophy. So by putting this older, very established Ernst Cassirer over against this new, quite revolutionary voice of Martin Heidegger, they were sure to set up a big event. And you can also tell by the other people who attended, there were a lot of other young philosophers that we know now who were also there. Levinas was there, Rudolf Carnap was there, Eugen Fink, Léon Brunswick, Jean Cavaillet, Herbert Marcuse, and some others. They were all there, and they all have these stories about what went down. The idea of the of the spring school, you should say, was to first have a series of independent lectures. So both Cassirer and Heidegger gave independent lectures in total of 4 hours, in which they explained some new ideas. In order to gradually set up this debate between the two of them. And there are some stories. At one point, Heidegger showed up in his skiing outfit because he didn't like spending that much time among the academics. He loved to go skiing. And then he would show up and give a talk still in his skiing outfit. Cassirer, on the other hand, at one point got ill while he was there, and so he couldn't attend Heidegger's lecture. But according to some stories, Heidegger came to his hotel room and gave him an update of what they had been talking about. And then the actual debate was sort of the culmination point. On April 2nd, 1929, they finally met for what is called the Davos debate. And the topic of this debate, but also of the whole school, was the human condition. And that set up also the topic for their own talks. And this is interesting because those independent lectures that Cassirer gave are lectures in which he positions his own philosophy, which is a philosophy of culture known as the philosophy of symbolic forms, which was well established. He had written about in a lot of books. And he positioned that own philosophy with regard to other contemporary philosophical currents like philosophical anthropology and Lebensphilosophie. And this is something that he only rarely did. And so this is the lectures from there are very interesting because of that. It's also interesting because by doing that, he comes into the domain that's more the domain that Heidegger is known for. Because of course, Heidegger had just developed this new analysis of Dasein, which looks like a philosophical anthropology, but he doesn't want to call it a philosophical anthropology because he wants to distinguish himself from Scheler and Plessner and all these people. But so by doing this, Cassirer gets onto the terrain that's more the one where Heidegger is at home. Cassirer is someone who is, in his writings, always in conversation with other philosophers from the history of philosophy, but not that often from contemporary thinkers. And so this is when that happens. And these lectures that he gave there would then be published as the 4th volume of Philosophy of Symbolic Form. Heidegger, on the other hand, used these lectures to apply his theory from being in time, that I assume most people in attendance will have heard about and knew the basic gist of. And he used his theory from being in time in order to develop a new interpretation of Kant's philosophy, which he would then publish as Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. But since Cassirer was the German expert on Kant's philosophy, by doing that, Heidegger also moved into the terrain that was more usually the one that was Cassirer was known for. So clearly they are setting up a lot of points of, agreement, but also disagreement. And so that looks great. So they're really setting up this actual debate amongst the two of them. Now, unfortunately, for a very long time, the actual debate between them was considered not to be a success at all. The whole idea was to bring together German and French thinkers, or at least to bring together thinkers and have them have a really thought-provoking, productive conversation that would reinvigorate intellectual debate. But the general, almost unanimous understanding or feeling of the actual debate is that, from people who were there, was that the older Cassirer was not a match for Heidegger, who embodied the sentiments of the new era. And there are multiple people. There's Bolno, who's one of the people who worked on the transcripts. There's Toni Cassirer, who's Ernst Cassirer's wife. There's also Levinas, who famously said that attending the Davos debate was like witnessing the end of a world. So this is Cassirer's world, and the creation of a new one. That would be Heidegger's world. And the idea seems to be widespread that Heidegger outshone Cassirer in a philosophical way, but also in a social-cultural way, and in a personal way. So on the one hand, philosophically, you have the system-oriented and subject-centered neo-Kantian thinking, which was not that popular anymore at the beginning of the 20th century, versus Heidegger's philosophy, which was based on lived experience, on this new phenomenological movement, which was much more in tune with what the younger audience was interested in. Also, socioculturally, Cassirer is someone who defends very optimistically still the Enlightenment ideals, which again, after the First World War, is not so easy to do anymore. Whereas on the other hand, you have a more pessimistic, you could say, existentialist view that Heidegger presents. And then also in all these reports, you see that everyone noticed a huge difference between Heidegger, who was this very charismatic personality, who was someone that, despite all the bad things we know now about Heidegger, someone who entered a room and really occupied the room, really had an enormous presence. People wanted to listen to him. His lectures were very, very well attended. And then on the other hand, you have Cassirer, who everyone says very erudite. He knows a lot. He's very wise. He has all the references just on top of his head, but not very inspiring appearance. So also in that sense, you see that almost everyone who's there seemed to have more sympathy for Heidegger. And the thing is also that Cassirer never got the chance to restore this image, because he had to emigrate. Cassirer was a Jewish German, and he had to emigrate from Germany in 1933, then went to London first, then to Stockholm, and then to the United States, where he taught at Yale first and Columbia. And he died on the campus of Columbia University. It's not that scary, but he died on the campus of Columbia University in 1945, just before the Second World War ended. So he also didn't get the opportunity to return. He was only 75 though. And so this story of these people very clearly occupying different philosophical, but also social, cultural, and personal positions, and very clearly everyone seeming to agree that Heidegger is the more interesting one, and then Cassirer never having the chance to recover from that, is the story that's most often told about this debate. There are two other philosophical books before this one appeared. One is from Michael Friedman. It's called A Parting of the Ways. It's how two philosophical currents parted ways and never met each other again. This book is about how continental philosophy and analytic philosophy departed around the Second World War, because a lot of thinkers had to flee from the United States. Heidegger was the only one who was left, and so got to dominate the philosophical field and got to really install continental philosophy, whereas on the other side of the ocean there's the analytic philosophy that really became blooming. And Friedman's theory is that Cassirer was one of the last figures who was able to unite these ways of doing philosophy, continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, but because people understood him to have lost the debate, that attempt to reconcile those positions seemed to no longer be interesting. The second book is by Peter Gordon. It's called Continental Divide. So it's once again about a divide. And it is about how all these... it's about a lot of people's recollection and reinterpretation afterwards of the debate. And all of these recollections are also about how they didn't really understand each other. So let me get into the question, which is the question that I answer differently from what most other people have done. Was there really a philosophical debate? Were they just talking next to each other, or was there one person who was just way better philosophically or also rhetorically than the other, so that there was no real debate? And I'm going to go through a few of the negative answers, because that has been the dominant frame, which is that this Davos debate was a very interesting historical moment, recording a large shift within 20th century thinking, but not a profound philosophical Auseinandersetzung. And the first source for this are newspapers. So imagine having philosophical spring schools and newspapers, journalists actually coming to report about this. This is what actually happened. And for example, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung says that instead of being witness to the clash of two worlds, one at best enjoyed the scene of a very polite man, this is Cassirer, and a very intense man who also made an exceptional effort to be polite. This is Heidegger. Both holding monologues. So this is how it's been described. Also in the Frankfurter Zeitung there's a very similar description. Heidegger confirms this picture. He writes in a letter to Elisabeth Blochmann just 10 days later that he didn't gain any philosophical insights. Now, Heidegger was always very critical of philosophical conferences. He never thought there were any philosophical insights to be gained. But here in particular, he said that he listed 3 reasons, and he says that the philosophical issues were too complex for a public debate. The second one was that there was too much of a sensationalist focus on the personalities, on the figure of Cassirer and the figure of Heidegger, instead of on the ideas. But the third reason he gives is also that Cassirer was too reconciliatory, that he didn't really want to get into a strong debate, but that he wanted to keep it too light, so to say. So Heidegger writes, during the discussion, Cassirer was extremely gentlemanly and almost too obliging. I therefore met with too little opposition, which prevented the problems from gaining the necessary sharpness of formulation. This is, of course, the account of one of the people who contributed to the debate, but we also have an account from the other side, not from Cassirer himself, but from John Michael Croyes, who is the philosopher who in the 1980s started the revived interest in Cassirer's philosophy. So this is a huge fan of Cassirer's thinking, but he also writes that whoever reads the protocol of the Davos debate today will get the impression that no debate took place, but that 2 ships rather passed each other in the night. Only declarations were made whereby Cassirer seemed to evade everything. So it's the same general picture, but now even someone who's philosophically clearly on the side of Cassirer also seems to put the blame on Cassirer. Cassirer was evading everything. But he does add something interesting, which is a defense of Cassirer's performance there, or of Cassirer's evasive attitude. And he explains, so Croyes explains that Cassirer is, during that debate, operating within a period that was already marked by clear political anti-Jewish sentiments. And he describes how just a few days before, a few weeks, I don't know, before the encounter in Davos, that there had been a series of anti-Semitic attacks from very high up scholars, but also, I know there's a lecture by a distinguished intellectual, but it was attended by high Nazi officials, in which neo-Kantianism was attacked because of the Jewish ideas that it imported into Kant studies, into German philosophy. And in particular, Hermann Cohen, who was Cassirer's teacher, was attacked. And so Croyes argues that Cassirer was actually more interested in defending neo-Kantianism and defending his teacher than in challenging Heidegger's ideas or critiques on his own terms. And I can agree to that, or I can see some of that reflected in the transcript of the Davos debate. There are certain points where Heidegger makes a critique, and if you know Cassirer, you actually know, so he could very well respond to this critique in a philosophical manner. He has a philosophical response based on his own insights, but he goes another way, and he seems much more interested in defending neo-Kantianism. So this may. This sounds like an interesting reading of the events as well. And indeed, the Davos debate itself started by Cassirer calling neo-Kantianism the scapegoat of modern philosophy, and by asking Heidegger to explain his view on this movement. So this is one So these are all instances of one popular understanding of the Davos debate, namely Cassirer didn't really want to philosophically debate, so there was no real philosophical debate, and it seems to be because, well, Heidegger was just much more profound, or a much stronger, or a much more forceful, or a better philosopher, whatever you want to call it. The second line of reading is not all that different, but it's interesting to see that has developed a whole line of readings in which this lack of philosophical engagement is even that there's no argument given for it, it's just taken for granted. And instead, the debate is valued in terms of political, cultural, religious, or sociological oppositions. And there are two lines there. So one are just non-philosophical assessments, that the Davos debate is paradigmatic for general ideological clashes from 20th century politics and philosophy or sociology, Weimar Republic versus Third Reich, Jewish cosmopolitanism versus Catholic provincialism, pacifism versus radicalism, optimism versus pessimism, modern thinking versus postmodern thinking. These are all, in broad terms, ways in which this Davos debate has been viewed. These are all non-philosophical assessments, and so I did not go into these at all in the book. The second one, and I already touched upon it, is viewing this debate from the lens of the history of philosophy. And so I already explained Friedman's book, A Parting of the Ways, very significant for making the debate famous again. Gordon's book, Continental Divide, is also just a very, very, very interesting reference work for everything, every details, every historical story, all the documents that are interesting for understanding the debate. But as I already said, neither of them are really interested in the debate itself. They're both interested in the Wirkungsgeschichte and how the debate, the history of how the debate was later on perceived, or the effect that it had on later philosophy. Friedman discusses only a few fragments, but is much more interested in the symbolic meaning of it for the course of analytic and continental philosophy. Gordon does go through the transcript in great detail, but in the end it's also still about this larger theory of what continental philosophy is like, namely the nature of continental philosophy is such that philosophical meaning cannot be easily disentangled from cultural and political memory. So he has this account of how the memory of that debate is used over and over again in order to create new positions within continental philosophy. And his claim is that that's part of the nature of continental philosophy, that its own history reshapes itself in various ways. Okay. So after all of that, it seems that I don't have a case at all to write the book that I did, but of course I think I do. My claim is this, so this is the basic claim of the book, that despite all of this, there was a philosophical debate going on in Davos. It is philosophically coherent, and there are clear and important philosophical stakes that are being defended by either party. Now, I do want to make clear that I don't want to deny at all that this public debate, of which we have the transcripts, we have the written transcripts, I don't want to deny that it is less coherent than other moments where they engage with each other's thoughts. For example, the separate lectures of Cassirer that he gave during Davos, but before the actual debate, he criticizes some of the ideas of being in time, and it's much clearer than what he says in the Davos debate itself. And it's clear if you read the transcripts that there are moments where either Cassirer or Heidegger seems to be caught off guard by something that the other one says, or that they don't really address what the other person says, and they go about and keep defending their own points. Now, I think in general, this is what a lot of debates are like anyway, and philosophical debates are as well. So if we're going to judge debates by very high standards of people only responding exactly to what the previous person has said, then a lot of debates would not be considered a real philosophical debate. So we shouldn't put the bar too high there in general. It's okay that in a live, non-scripted debate that, you know, not everything is a perfect response to the other speaker. I think if we analyze the debate, that you can still consider it a fruitful departing point for investigating the overall philosophical relation between Cassirer and Heidegger, but also for understanding the coherence and the stakes of Cassirer's own philosophy and of Heidegger's early philosophy. First, my main argument for that is that the Davos debate, if you look at everything that's being said there are a lot of topics that are being touched upon, but overall, it hinges on three philosophical issues, which also structure the entire conversation between Cassirer and Heidegger. Because the conversation between Cassirer and Heidegger is not limited just to those 3 weeks in Davos, but they responded to each other in footnotes in their own works, in book reviews of the other people's work. They also met each other a few times. And that all lasted from 1923 until 1946. So that's 23 years long, in which every now and then they engage with each other's philosophy. And Cassirer doesn't do that a whole lot, like I already said, engage with contemporary philosophers. Heidegger doesn't do that too often either. He will also be much more, he has these long books and lectures on Nietzsche or on Kant or on Aristotle, but engaging with contemporaries is also not something that we see all that often. And so my first claim is that the same philosophical issues that structure the Davos debate are also the same three philosophical issues that structure that entire 23-year-long conversation. And those issues are the lasting meaning of Kant's thought, or the continuous relevance of Kant's thought, if you will, the human condition, and the task of philosophy. So these are three topics that in the same order will also pop up in these footnotes and in these reviews, and that's where the real tensions lie between the two thinkers. And that's interesting, really, I would say, because those three topics are also the three key topics of Cassirer's philosophy of culture and Heidegger's early philosophy. I would argue that if you understand Cassirer's view of the lasting meaning of Kant's thought, Cassirer's view or account of the human condition, and his notion of the task of philosophy, if you understand those three things about Cassirer, then you understand the entire framework of what his philosophy is about. And then there are, of course, a lot of gaps to be filled in, and there are more detailed things that he works out. But those are the three structural issues. If you understand those, then you have a very good grasp of what Cassirer is about. Because Cassirer is someone who develops Kant's critique of reason into a critique of culture. If you understand how his critique of culture stems as a development of Kant's critique of reason, that's a very important pillar of his philosophy. He also has an account of human subjectivity as an animal symbolicum. We are symbolic animals. So if you understand what he means by us being symbolic animals, namely that we always perceive everything as having, containing, carrying symbolic meaning, then you understand the second very important pillar of his thought. The third one, the topic of the task of philosophy, if you understand what he is after with his philosophy of culture, namely to develop a very broad view of what all the different types of meaning that human beings bring forth, political meaning, scientific meaning, artistic meaning, economic meaning, religious meaning, and so on, and how he thinks those kinds of meanings are related to each other within human culture or humanity as a whole. That's what he is about. Then you also understand the goal or the motivation of his thought. Now the same goes, I would say, for early Heideggerian philosophy. If you understand his connection to Kant, if you understand his view of the human condition and his notion of the task of philosophy, those two things and how they are related to each other, then you understand what early Heidegger is about. which is again not to say that then you will understand every single line he has written, but that's really the framework. Because, of course, early Heidegger has this famous reinterpretation of the human condition, his notion of Dasein and what that means. But parallel to that, he has this notion of the destruction or the deconstruction of the history of philosophy. In order to regain the question of being, we need to go backwards through the history of philosophy and undo the covering up that Western philosophy has done. And he considers Kant as one of the important figures where that happened. So deconstructing Kant's thought also teaches us what the purpose is and what the method is of his destruction of the history of philosophy. And then the task of philosophy is, of course, this rediscovering of the meaning of being, the question of being. And the destruction of the history of philosophy and the analytic of Dasein are the two preliminary steps in retrieving that question of being. So if you understand those three issues, then you understand what Heidegger is about. So that was the main point, why I think that once you notice that those three topics are in the debate, are the focal points of the debate between Cassirer and Heidegger, then you see that their actual full philosophy is at stake in that debate. And of course they talk different languages, and so they don't always understand each other. And of course they have very different opinions of what the human condition is, or the task of philosophy is, and they really disagree. But they are talking about the topics that are the most important philosophical topics for them. In addition, if you look at the transcript of the Davos debate, you see that there's a certain order between these three topics. And they don't just stand beside each other. But if you read through it, then you see that there's what I call a hierarchical relationship. Namely that their disagreement and their discussion about Kant is motivated by their disagreement about the human condition. And their disagreement about the human condition is motivated by their different understanding of the task of philosophy. When they're initially talking about Kant, they still emphasize their commonalities. They're both think that Kant's account of transcendental imagination, for example, is one of the most important passages in Kant's philosophy. This was a very novel idea, actually, but they shared it. They also think that in Kant, there's much less distinction between subjectivity and objectivity than was commonly emphasized. But then at one point they do part ways, they have a different understanding of that relationship, but they don't really explain it until they start talking about the human condition. And so you see that what they were really disagreeing about is a larger idea of what the human condition is. And there again, they have some commonalities, and at one point they disagree again, and you see that it's actually really because they disagree on what the task of philosophy is. For Cassirer, by the way, that is to enlighten us, to free us from our natural limitations and to be culturally productive beings. For Heidegger, on the other hand, it is to not to overcome our nature, but to reconcile ourselves with our own finitude, with our anxiety, with our being towards death. And so that's a very different notion. And so what I'm arguing in the book is that these three issues cannot be understood independently from each other, but also that the true stakes of the debate only come about when we near the end and when we're talking about the task of philosophy. So that's the second point. And then the third point is that although they have very clear different views on what the human condition is or how it should be understood, they have very clear, very different understanding of what the task of philosophy is, I nevertheless argue that if you look at the whole picture of it, that they are fundamentally concerned with a shared topic. Something that it also seems to be denied by all these accounts that they were talking past each other. And that is, that topic is the human capacity to orient ourselves within and towards the world. Cassirer's philosophy about his philosophy of culture is about how we are capable of orienting ourselves in a scientific way in the world, how we are capable of orienting ourselves in an artistic way in the world, in a religious way in the world, in a mythical way in the world. He has a lot of books in which he addresses one of what he calls symbolic forms. So science is a symbolic form, politics is a symbolic form, myth, religion, and so art. And so he discusses how we are capable of orienting ourselves within that cultural domain or that symbolic form. But then he also has a number of meta-reflections in which he considers how we are capable of having these multiple ways of orienting ourselves, how that can be combined, how those are not just completely separate worlds, but still both human worlds. And so what he's really interested in is our capacity to have these multiple symbolic forms, to not only think in a religious way or only in a political way, but to have these different sorts of orientations that are all meaningful, and to make sure that they don't all get succumbed under another. And that was his main critique of the political myth of Nazi ideology, that everything, that all symbolic forms were suppressed under this sort of mythical political symbolic form. And that art only matters for political reasons, that economy only matters for political reasons, and so on. So that's Cassirer. So he has all these works about orienting ourselves within a symbolic form, but he's really interested in how we orient ourselves towards this diversity of orientations. And the same you can see with Heidegger, whose analysis of Dasein, the first book of Being and Time, is clearly about how we orient ourselves in the world in a meaningful way before we even start rationalizing things. It's about how we pre-ontologically, as he said it, already understand how we relate to other beings, how beings relate to each other in a meaningful way. And so that's an existential way of orienting yourself in the world. But then, as we see in book 2 of Being and Time, what he finds really interesting is to see how we can orient ourselves towards that pre-ontological orientation. What he's really interested in seeing the difference between a fallen orientation within the world or an owned or authentic way of orienting ourselves. And so authenticity or ownness means that you adopt a certain attitude, that you orient yourselves in a certain way with regard to the everyday way we always orient ourselves in the world. It's not starting to do a whole lot of other things. It's becoming more aware of that we orient ourselves all the time in the world, how we do that, and maybe how we can do it in a more genuine way. So both thinkers are interested in how we understand ourselves in the world and how we understand ourselves towards the world. That's what philosophy can do. And then all the difficulties in trying to match these two things. Because for Heidegger, for example, it's not that once we know how to be authentic or owned, that we will always be it. No, we'll always fall back into the world. And so there's these interesting philosophical tensions. So that's I think the shared project that they have. They both understand the human being as a being that fundamentally is invested in orienting itself in the world and towards the world. And they both believe that we can only understand the human being as such if we get rid of that subjective-objective duality. Now, of course, again, this is not to say that they're saying the same thing or that their projects are just parallel alternatives. They do have this shared interest. And then where I think they depart, but in a complementary way, is that what Cassirer is really interested in is the question how we can orient ourselves in all these different ways. How can we orient ourselves in a scientific way, in a political way, in an economic way, in a religious way, and how can we switch between those forms of orientation? And that's why he will emphasize the finitude, the capacity, the spontaneity, in Kantian terms, of the human being. Whereas Heidegger is really interested in why we need to orient ourselves. Why do we have to find meaning for ourselves in other beings, in the day? Why do we have to be in the world in order to make any sense of ourselves? And the answer is, of course, because we are nothing. Because we don't have a fixed identity, we don't have a fixed origin, we don't have a fixed purpose, we are only potentiality. So that is his leading question, and so that's how you end up with the idea of human beings as finite. We don't have a starting point, as finite, why his notion of anxiety is so important, because that's where we understand that we are nothing, that we are finite. And so, given this shared concern about the human capacity to orient itself, they still ask different questions. The how question, how are we capable of doing that, and why do we have to do that? And so in that sense, and that's how I conclude the book, it's also possible to still see them as complementary and to read them together. So that was my story about the book. I have time left? Yeah?
Yes, I think. Yes, you talked 42 minutes.
Yeah.
As you.
I'll try to apply this story now to the topic of transcendental philosophy. Maybe I will have to go a little bit quicker about this, but a lot of the things I've already pointed out, we'll see. If you don't understand anything, of course, we can discuss it. So Kant pops up very often during this debate, and the interesting thing is that it's not only during the first topic, which is Kant, but also when they talk about the human condition. Then still, this idea of orientation is an idea that also shows up in Kant. Kant has this great essay about how to orient oneself in thinking, which is a fantastic summary of his idea of how theoretical reason and practical reason are connected to each other. And you can read it as an essay on how we can orient ourselves within theoretical reason, namely on the basis of this idea of God, how we can orient ourselves within practical reason based on the postulates of practical reason. But then he also asks about how these two kinds of orientation connect to each other, and then he discusses the hierarchy between practical and theoretical reason. So there you also have the question of how to orient ourselves within uses of reason and then towards these uses of reason. And when we talk about the task of philosophy, also both Cassirer and Heidegger will, at certain instances, point back to Kant's notion of a cosmopolitan conception of philosophy, and so they also take from that. So also on these other topics, Kant is a looming figure there. And actually I find Kant more interesting, the role that Kant plays more interesting when it comes to these two other topics that are not Kant itself. When we talk about the first part though, they both have an understanding of what transcendental philosophy should be, and that clashes at one point. So Cassirer wants to expand the use of the transcendental method or transcendental philosophy. He wants to look for the conditions of possibility of experience or of objectivity, but not just within mathematics and physics, as Kant seems to do in the first critique, but in all these different cultural domains or symbolic forms. Right? So he expands the same style of philosophy, the same method of philosophy, and also will go and investigate language, for example. What are the conditions of possibility for linguistic meaning or linguistic objectivity, or religion, or mythology? Right? So these are cultural domains that wouldn't have a rational place within Kant's thinking, but he wants to really broaden that sphere. And so he pluralizes that transcendental method in a way, because it will take on a little bit of different forms depending on which cultural domain you're engaging with. And so he has to update Kant's philosophy. He will, instead of talking about categories, he will talk about symbols, and the symbols are much more versatile because the same symbols of space and time and causality play a role within scientific thinking, within religious thinking, within political thinking, but in a different way. So he makes a distinction between political time and religious time and scientific time. And it's always the symbol of time that's constitutive of scientific, religious, political objectivity, but it's a different notion of time. And then I can't go into detail, but in order to do that, he has to model his symbol more on the basis of the schema of the critique of judgment and not on the categories of the first critique. He also rethinks the idea of transcendental imagination. It becomes symbolic imagination, which is the capacity to always, whenever you intuit something, perceive something intelligible there, something that rationally intersubjectively shareable. And he also rethinks the rules of the understanding that Kant relies on into functions of consciousness. And so he says that the human subjective, the animal symbolicum has multiple functions of consciousness. Sometimes we symbolically imagine things according to an expressive function, which means that what we see seems to be a direct the meaning that we understand seems to be a direct expression of what we see. That would be the case in mythical thinking, where a god is, for example, the tree itself, whereas in later symbolic forms, in religion, for example, a god is a more abstract figure, it's a more representational symbol. Maybe the tree represents the god, but it isn't the god itself. And then in scientific thinking, you have signifying functions in which there's no more clear visual connection between the meaning of something and then the symbol for it. So if you talk about space, it's no longer about the visual space, but it's the kind of space that you can put on an axis, and I mean, you don't see the space, but you're talking about that. And so it's because of these different functions of consciousness that we can still talk about space, but at one point it's mythical space, at another point it's political space or scientific space. And so for Cassirer, this is really expanding this use of transcendental philosophy, and he will see it as Kant doing this investigation of a condition of possibilities for scientific understanding of the world. But he understands this scientific understanding and mathematical and physical understanding of the world as just the source of inspiration that Kant saw in Newtonian science, but not necessarily the most important or the most insightful way of understanding the world. So he doesn't want a hierarchy of science being a much more correct or a more insightful outlook on the world than art or religion or politics or whatever. Heidegger, on the other hand, has a account, very provocative, questionable, but very, very interesting and intriguing account or assessment of Kant's transcendental philosophy as ontology. So he says Kant's understanding of transcendental philosophy is the same as ontology, which seems completely absurd at first sight, because Kant is the one who says we cannot know the things in themselves, we don't even need to talk about it, and then so it seems to be a complete departure from ontology, and Heidegger says no, this is what ontology is. So how can we understand that? Ontology for Heidegger is about being instead of about beings, but it's about the being of beings. What makes beings appear in a meaningful way as they can to us. And the being of beings that allows beings to appear to us in this intelligible way is a condition of possibility for beings to appear that itself has to remain hidden most of the time. So that is why we are almost all the time focused on beings. And actually the only way in which we see this as beings and understand them as beings according to Heidegger is because we have some understanding of their being, this pre-ontological understanding of the being of beings, but we never focus on it, we're never fully aware, we just think that these are things, that these are beings, and we have forgotten to ask the question about their being, which is, for Heidegger, their serviceability, the fact that these are tools or equipment by means of which I can do things. I can give this talk. I can prepare this. I can pretend that I am someone who has something to say. I can comport myself in a certain way. I can have a relation with an audience and all these things through these beings. And so what ontology is, and for Heidegger also what transcendental philosophy is the exercise to make these conditions of possibility of our experience, of our meaningful experience, to make this visible. If you understand it like this, it already sounds more like Kant, who is also about figuring out what the conditions of possibility of objective experience are. And when Heidegger explains this in Being and Time, he even refers to Kant, and when he's talking about what being is, as distinguished from beings, he gives Kant's notions of space and time as an example of that. So those are the kind of conditions of possibility that make it possible that things appear to us as objectively meaningful, but that themselves always remain hidden. This is what Kant also says. We can't experience space, we can't experience time. Why not? Because they are the conditions of us experiencing anything at all. So if we understand that what Heidegger means here by being is a sort of a condition of possibility that also relies on Dasein, then we can see more how you can understand that notion of ontology as something like transcendental philosophy. And so the distinction that Heidegger then wants to make is between transcendental knowledge and empirical knowledge. And empirical knowledge is having empirical knowledge of this being white and this being round and this being hard, whereas transcendental knowledge is the transcendental or ontological knowledge of understanding the objectivity of this as such. So the fact that this is a piece of equipment that I can use for certain purposes or not. And so my Dasein making it possible to understand this as a meaningful object. So empirical knowledge, you could say, is about individual objects or things. Transcendental knowledge is about objectivity, the possibility of objectivity as such. And Heidegger also goes into the fact that Kant talked about natural beings when he gives these examples from physics and from mathematics. But Heidegger wants to make it clear that actually what's at stake is a general ontology in Kant, that Kant only used these examples of natural objects because that's the way that historically philosophers talked about beings as natural kinds. But that Kant was never really interested in natural science or particularly in natural beings or entities, but in objectivity or being as such. So this is how I explain Cassirer's reconception or transformation of Kant's transcendental philosophy into a transcendental philosophy of culture, and then Heidegger's reinterpretation of transcendental philosophy as ontology, which seems absurd at first hand. It does make sense on second thought if you understand the terms being used properly, which is not to say that there's a whole can of worms, of course, whenever we go into the details of that reading. This sets up one of the first topics of contention between Cassirer and Heidegger during Davos, which is Heidegger's critique of Cassirer, but also of the other neo-Kantians, as interpreting Kant and the first critique as in an epistemological way. So I don't know if you've heard this, but this is one of the ways in which they are often pitted against each other, that Cassirer and Neo-Kantians have an epistemological reading of the first critique, and Heidegger has an ontological reading of the first critique. Now, to put it this way is to adopt Heidegger's framework. Right? To be clear, this is how Heidegger criticized the existing popular interpretation of Kant by the Neo-Kantians as epistemological, and he proposes something new, namely this ontological reading instead. In addition to that, he emphasizes that it's not an ontology of the natural sciences, but that Kant was after a general ontology. So there are two parts of this critique of Cassirer and of Neo-Kantianism. It's about the intention. It's not epistemology what Kant did, it's ontology. That's what Heidegger says. And also the scope. It's not just ontology of nature, of natural kinds, but general ontology. And let me just go into those 2 points to conclude. Let's go into the scope. That's actually what he says is more important, that it's about ontology as such. This again at first sight looks very weird to criticize Cassirer of having a too limited scope. If anyone had a very, very wide scope of what he was interested, it's Cassirer. Cassirer was not at all just interested in the object experience or objectivity or the cultural domain of science, because he was also interested in language and art, in religion and myth and politics. He wrote about tribes from all over the world, had all these anthropological theories of tribes or of people that didn't share any of the modern natural scientific theories, but in which he found this theory nevertheless. So you can't claim at all that Cassirer would be someone who's just doing epistemology of natural science. He has all these other interests. He actually wants to develop a general theory of meaning. And he doesn't even think that science is the most important cultural domain. When it comes to Cassirer's reading of Kant, is there an epistemological component? According to Heidegger, Kant's focus on the natural sciences is not just exemplary, and then we have to apply it to the other spheres of culture in addition, but it's misleading. And so what he objects in Cassirer's reading of Kant is that we shouldn't read the first critique as applying the transcendental method to natural science and then applying that to other domains as well, or to further ground it in a broader theory of culture. But we need to understand that already in Kant, it is about being as such. It already has depth and breadth to provide a general theory of being. So that's the critique there. So this is the difference between these two notions, two approaches to the first critique. Do we understand Kant's first critique to be about nature, and then we repeat that exercise with regard to other domains of human culture? Or do we already, to begin with, understand it as a general theory of being that happens to use examples taken from natural science? So this is one point of contestation. The other one then is about the difference between epistemology and ontology. Is transcendental philosophy, is it an epistemological exercise, or is it an ontological one? Here in the Davos debate, the meaning of epistemology remains completely unclear. He doesn't, and also in other critiques of Neo-Kantianism, he doesn't really explain what he means by epistemology. So we have to look for it elsewhere, and the only way in which I could make sense of it is that the distinction between epistemology and ontology is related to that between ontic knowledge and ontological knowledge. So again, epistemology is then about things. How do different things relate to each other? More specifically, how do ideas in my mind, those things, relate to objects in nature out there? That would be the epistemological question. So it's about empirical objects and how they relate to each other. Whereas ontological knowledge is about the possibility of objectivity as such. Before we engage with the question, how can particular objects be related to each other, the question is, how can there be such a thing as objectivity to begin with? How can things appear to us as objects to begin with? So that's again the difference then between empirical knowledge and empirical outlook and a transcendental outlook. Here as well, at first you would say this doesn't make sense to criticize Cassirer from doing that. Cassirer as well strongly objects to the separation of subjects and objects that then afterwards need to epistemologically reconnect with each other. So he rejects that, and what he seems to be interested in his entire philosophy is also the question of the possibility of objectivity, but then of these various forms. How is scientific objectivity possible? How is religious objectivity possible? How is artistic objectivity possible? So he seems to be asking all these questions that Heidegger would call ontological as well. So it still remains unclear what the difference is, and more particular, why this would be an epistemological reading of Kant. Now the real difference, and this is really my last point, is in what they take such transcendental knowledge or transcendental philosophy to accomplish. It seems to be going about the same thing. It's about the condition of possibility of objectivity as such, but what is their interest when they want to answer that question? And I'm going to be repeating what I said about the general distinction between the how and the why question, but now related to their disagreement about Kant, is that Heidegger is interested in how the possibility of objectivity is grounded in subjectivity. He's interested in the mere existence, the mere presence of these rules of understanding, these categories in human subjectivity. The fact that, in Kantian terms, we possess these categories based on which we can based on which we can constitute objectivity, that's the real interesting question. And how is this grounded in subjectivity? What does that say about human subjectivity? Whereas Cassirer is interested in the legitimacy of these structures of human subjectivity. So Cassirer is interested in how can these categories then produce legitimate, valid knowledge or claims, or knowledge claims. And we can see this difference in focus, which is again the difference between the why and the how question, but now it's about the ground. How is this grounded in human subjectivity? What does that say about the human condition? Or how is it possible to have these structures and then from there find their objective validity? We can see this if you look at their different analysis. It's very specific, very detailed, of the transcendental deduction and the two sides of that. Kant makes a distinction between the subjective deduction of the categories of the understanding and the objective deduction. The subjective one proves that within human subjectivity we have these fixed categories, so they have universal validity. And then the objective deduction aims to show how having these categories, how possessing these categories, how that can produce or lead to objectively valid knowledge claims or truth claims. And they both acknowledge that you can't have one without the other, that the subjective and the objective deduction are two sides of the same coin, but they will emphasize one more than the other. And so Heidegger thinks that if you understand the subject, or if Kant executed the subjective deduction, actually he should have never bothered with the objective deduction anymore. The moment you've shown that these categories lie there in human subjectivity, you've already shown the capacity of human subjectivity to make objective claims. Whereas Cassirer seems to think that the other step is the more important one, to show how this is possible. So if you look at it, if you understand it in that way, then you can see that in the end, Cassirer is interested in transcendental philosophy or ontology, if you want to call it that, as using Heidegger's term, in order to then be able to figure out how ontechnology is possible. Heidegger is interested in ontology for ontology's own sake, because he wants to understand metaphysics, the possibility and the problem of metaphysics, and how that possibility and problem lies within human Dasein itself. So in that one way, I think you can have an interesting distinction between an epistemological and an ontological reading, and you can map that onto Cassirer and Heidegger, even though I think it's a misleading term. But when you thus understand it as transcendental philosophy in the end serves to understand how we can have ontech-knowledge, then it serves an epistemological purpose, even though it's not itself epistemology. Or ontology needs to be understood itself, and then it gains a metaphysical purpose, and that's of course the road that Heidegger goes down to. So that's to interpret and to make some sense of these two understandings of the meaning and also the use of transcendental philosophy. And I hope you can also see the parallels with the larger story that I try to paint. So thank you for listening so carefully.
Thank you very much.